right, I think I'll kick us off. There may be some more people trickling in. But welcome again. My name is Oliver Tully. I'm a manager on the electricity team at RMI. Thank you all very much for being with us here today. This webinar is being recorded and will be available later on our website. Today, we are really excited to talk about fuel cost sharing and return on equity and explore some recent analysis from Laura Sanchez Bolaños at Verita Advisory. For those who don't know, RMI is a global nonprofit with around 700 or so staff members working to ensure a prosperous energy transition for all. We work regularly with commissions, utilities, and consumer advocates and other stakeholders in a variety of different ways, providing independent technical analysis and support. In terms of today's agenda, I'm going to kick us off with a brief introductory overview of what fuel cost sharing is, and then the bulk of the webinar will be a presentation from Laura on her recent report. And then my colleague Gabby will come on with Laura to facilitate audience Q&A. So throughout the presentation, feel free to send questions through the Q&A chat function, and we'll address those in writing as we can throughout the session, and then talk about them at the end of the presentation. So at a high level, I'd like to start with some reflections on how utilities recover costs for the fuel that's used to generate electricity at power plants. What we've seen is that existing processes and regulatory structures for how vertically integrated utilities recover these costs creates perverse incentives and undermines affordability goals. So utilities in vertically integrated states that own generation typically pass 100% of fuel costs through to customers via a fuel adjustment clause or a similar mechanism that may have a different name depending on the jurisdiction. And as a result of the pass-through of those fuel costs in that manner, utility customers bear essentially all of the risk of fuel price volatility, even though they have the least amount of agency in controlling those costs compared to the utility itself. And this dynamic creates what economists call a moral hazard, where one party, in this case, the utility, makes the decisions, and a different party, utility customers, bears the risks of those decisions. It did not always work this way. And for much of the 20th century, fuel costs were the responsibility of the utility and were recovered through base rates. Public utility commissions included fuel costs as just one of the utility's many costs of doing business. And with the crises of the two world wars and the extreme price volatility that those created, PUCs implemented what were designed to be temporary fuel pass-through policies. But those were ended after the wars themselves concluded. The same occurred during the OPEC crisis in the 1970s as a way to address extreme volatility. But in that case, those pass-through policies remained in place after the crisis was over and were never meaningfully revisited, and in general have persisted up until today. And this dynamic of a 100% pass-through of those fuel costs insulates utilities from the risk of poor fuel cost management decisions. And in doing so, it reduces incentives for the utilities to carefully manage their spending on fuel. This undermines affordability and reinforces a reliance on legacy fuels that are often price volatile. And this is further exacerbated by the growing reliance on natural gas as a fuel. And as this recent chart from LBNL and Brattle shows, price increases in natural gas are a key driver of wholesale electricity prices. In light of these challenges, fuel cost sharing is receiving increased attention in a number of states as a key policy solution to support affordability. As I'll describe in a moment, fuel cost sharing gives utilities stronger incentives to better manage fuel costs. And in doing so, it helps mitigate customer exposure to price volatility. Fuel cost sharing works by adjusting how much of overall fuel costs are passed through to customers rather than the default 100%. So the utility is responsible for part of the cost difference, which gives them financial skin in the game. And this creates an incentive to better plan for and account for price volatility and to seek out cost savings. And what we consider to be full fuel cost sharing is implemented currently in 9 states, which are noted here in yellow. And to provide a little bit more detail on how fuel cost sharing works, I have a few examples that I'll run through. So say, for example, a utility forecasts $1 million in fuel costs for the coming year. That's their fuel budget, so to speak. If actual fuel costs at the end of that year are $1.5 million, there's a $500,000 difference. The sharing amount in terms of fuel cost sharing is relative to that 500,000 differential. Under a traditional pass-through described in this kind of call-out box, ratepayers would pay that full amount, including the entire 500K differential. If you take what is a common fuel cost sharing structure, a 90-10% sharing policy, for example, ratepayers would only pay 450,000 of that difference, and the utility would pay that 10% of the difference. So in this case, 50,000. The flip side of this is if actual costs for fuel are lower than what they were expected to be. If actual costs, for example, are 900,000 compared to that $1 million estimate, there's a 100K differential. And again, under a traditional pass-through policy, ratepayers would have received that full 100K in savings. Under fuel cost sharing, 10% of that differential, so $10,000, is retained by the utility as a reward. But both of these scenarios create incentives for the utility to reduce costs, either to increase potential rewards that they earn or to keep potential penalties as low as possible, all of which is designed in the long term to deliver cost savings for customers. RMI has done analysis recently on the impact of fuel cost sharing, what it could be across states. And our analysis is based on publicly available data. And we built a tool that allows users to calculate illustrative results from fuel cost sharing. So if you take the most common sharing policy, that 90-10% sharing as an example with a symmetrical sharing design, and you include a cap of 1% of the previous year's total electric retail sales, these are the results that we see. You see quite significant customer savings over the 5 years that we looked at, 2020 through 2024. This is just a sampling of states, and you can use our tool for other states. But for example, you would see over $36 million in cumulative net ratepayer savings over those 5 years in Nevada, and upwards of $89 million in North Carolina. Again, I'll have a link to the actual tool later in the slide deck. Despite the potential benefits of fuel cost sharing, when regulators have considered the policy, what we've seen is that critics claim that with the exposure to a portion of fuel cost volatility for the utility, that means that the utility should be eligible for a higher authorized return on equity, or ROE. And RMI commissioned Vrida Advisory to examine those arguments in detail and to evaluate whether they were valid. Which brings us to Laura's presentation. and not to preempt any of her conclusions, but I'll pass it to her to walk us through the report's findings.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Oliver, for that introduction. I hope you're not able to hear my dog in the background that decided to start barking just now. But let's see. So before I get into why utilities and their supporters push back on fuel cost sharing and their case for higher allowed ROEs, I'm going to see here, walk you through very quickly what we're going to do in the next 30 minutes to 35. So first, why we are spending time on fuel cost recovery reform today. It has to do with power demand, investment needs, and the impacts to affordability. Second, I will build on Oliver's points around the status quo, specifically about tools that regulators or policymakers can implement in certain states to fix the imbalances that today we see. We're going to cover fuel cost sharing specifically. Oliver already covered the basics, and I'm going to focus on some design features. Then most of our time is going to be spent on arguments against transitioning from 100% pass-through, which I call it a FAM, is fuel adjustment mechanism. I think in Oliver's slides, we saw it as fuel adjustment clauses, but they're the same, to a fuel cost sharing policy. And we're going to look at the financial theory, what the financial theory and what the regulatory precedent tell us about this. And then I'm going to wrap up with 4 key takeaways. After that, I think we'll open and answer some of the questions in Q&A. So let's see. So why is that we're looking at fuel cost recovery and pushing for reform? You've probably seen this in many ways before, but basically electricity demand is rising significantly in the US. S&P Global projects an annual growth rate in the range of 1.9 to 2.7% through 2034. That is around 3 to 4.5 times the average that we saw in the past 20 years of 0.6%. So that growth means that there is a lot of investment that's required in the sector to just keep it running. The EI, or the Edison Electric Institute, forecasts that investor-owned utilities, most investor-owned utilities in the US, in total, plan to invest $1.1 trillion between 2025 and 2029. This is around 1.5 times the $765 billion spent in the past 5 years. So given how costs are recovered, this brings me to the third bucket here. This new investment is not just paid by the large customers that are driving electricity demand, but it is socialized or spread across different customers. Using a 7.5% weighted average cost of capital, we estimated that $1.1 trillion investment need would represent around $100 billion annually in financing costs alone. This is just the interest rate, an interest rate applied on the debt portion, which is 50%, and a cost of equity or return on equity applied on the equity portion, which is 50%, and then we net that of taxes. So that only makes the affordability crisis worse. On the left-hand side here, what you can see is a handful of news headlines just bringing attention to what's happening with power prices in the US. But I would point you to the chart. This is a chart from Bloomberg. It shows the changes in wholesale prices between 2020 and 2025. The darker the dot, so the darker yellow, shows the higher increases. So if you can look at the text, hopefully you can. I'll point out some cities on the East Coast. Buffalo is up 197% from 2020 to 2025. Again, this is wholesale prices. Baltimore is up 125%. Chicago is up 64%. Tulsa, 108%. If you go to the West Coast, San Francisco is up 65%. I'm sorry, not 165, but it's still quite significant. And the point being here that power prices are just rising astronomically. So why does fuel cost reform matters, or why does that matter today? What you look here on the left side of this slide is the average electricity bill split in most of the US. This is the average between 2020 and 2024. And what you see in the orange color, the darker one is cost of power. That includes fuel costs, which are related to natural gas power plants, coal plants, nuclear plants. It also includes power purchases, and that alone represents 31% of the average customer bill. Utility profits, which is the lighter orange, represents 16%. So combined, that is over 45% of the average bill. Under current practices, the way fuel costs are recovered basically creates real imbalances, and they work against customers. So what is that? What's the status quo? And this is what Oliver was talking about. He already explained a little bit about this and where they came from. So I'm going to focus on the bottom of this slide, and I'm going to walk you through something that's not on the slide, but just bear with me here. Let's say the process starts with an IRP, an integrated resource plan, which is where utilities lay out their preferred generation mix to meet power demand years out in the future. So regulators review plan and approve it or reject it. Let's say a utility proposes adding 1 gigawatt of natural gas power generation, and the regulator approves that based on the cost projections the utility presented at the time of the IRP. Later on, a rate case comes, and that investment is included in the rate case if construction has started or the plant is already in operations. And that's where rates get set using baseline projections. Those baseline projections include, I think, can't remember how Oliver called it, but it can be called the baseline, the target, but it's basically the base projections that were included in rates. That baseline is embedded in the per kilowatt hour base rate, and that stays fixed until the next rate case. In some states, this is every year. In other states, this is every 3 years or longer. Now, what FAMs do, I call it FAMs, so fuel adjustment mechanisms. What they do is that they allow utilities to reconcile the difference between actual costs and projected costs, and charge or credit that difference to customers outside of the rate case. It can be several times a year. It can be quarterly. It can be twice a year. It can be once a year. And here's where this gets interesting. The fuel cost projections behind the IRP and behind the rate case assumed certain commodity price. And they probably assume that they were fairly stable. They might have assumed a little bit of variation. Now, let's say something happens, something like a polar vortex, the war in Ukraine, or the 2026 war in Iran, and commodity prices spike. Customers under a FAM are 100% responsible for paying that higher commodity price. However, they had no say in choosing gas over other technologies. They had no say in the contract length of getting that commodity, in hedging practices, in procurement timing, in storage. All those decisions were made by the utility. And looking at regulators may not have approved that technology in the first place, back in the IRP or back in the rate case, if they had known how volatile commodity prices were going to be. So this is all to say, FAMs, when they were introduced back in the 1970s, they made sense. But today, 50 years later, it's true, utilities cannot control fuel prices, but they now have far more tools available to control fuel costs and fuel outputs. And one of those, or one way to fix this, well, let me first spend a little bit more time here. Stepping back a little bit, Oliver already talked about FAMs creating a moral hazard. So that's just sort of human behavior, is how I see it. It's a situation in which if you don't see any consequence, you, number one, engage in risky behavior because you're not going to see the consequences of your behavior, or you fail to optimize the outcome because no matter what happens, it's not going to affect you. That's a moral hazard. Number two, funds distort risk allocation in resource planning. And this is what I was telling you about for that 1 gigawatt of natural gas power plant, where basically regulators approve new resources based on the utility projections back when the filing was made. But costs are not fixed then. Actual costs actually change and could deviate significantly from those that were forecasted and therefore approved. And number three, funds could affect the integrity of competitive procurement processes. What do I mean by this? Basically, in some states, you have competitive procurement processes where utilities have to compete against IPPs or independent power producers. I call this as a soft bid. They basically compete, they present an estimate or what their costs are going to be to build and to operate that power plant. And let's say they win the bid. But then over time, the mechanisms in place allow them to pass extra costs to customers. In some cases, that could be 100% of the extra cost. In some cases, it could be part of that, and shareholders eat a little bit of the excess cost. But in general, the utility won a bid based on prices that are not real, based on prices that are changing significantly, and they have the tools to pass that extra cost to customers. So that's what I mean by affecting the integrity of a competitive process. Now, here is where we go to fuel cost sharing and a way to fix these imbalances. Oliver already explained what fuel cost sharing is, and he gave a great example of the 90-10 split. Interestingly enough, I'm not going to go over that again, but he walked us through an overrun scenario, one in which costs are higher than expected. So in a 90-10, utilities cover 90% of that extra cost, utilities cover 10%. And then he also walked us through an underrun scenario or a savings scenario. And that is one in which costs actually come in lower than expected. So in a 90-10 symmetrical sharing, utilities get to, or customers get to receive 90% of the savings, and utilities receive 10% of the savings. Interestingly, critics of fuel cost sharing never see that positive scenario. They mostly focus in an overrun scenario where they have to now eat a risk that they didn't have to do before. On the right-hand side of this chart, there are just some design features that are common for fuel cost sharing policies. And these are things that can really change how risk allocation happens. Deadbands is just the amount outside the baseline that utilities are going to cover. It tends to be very small. Let's say it could be a percentage or it could be a dollar number, a dollar value based on the utility revenues, previous revenues. But let's say it's 1% of the baseline, up and down. If actual costs are 1% above the baseline, the utility is going to pay for that. If it's less than 1%, the utility is going to keep that money. Sharing percentages, that is the 90-10 example that Oliver gave. Symmetry or asymmetry of sharing. And this one is important. The last two, I think, are very important in terms of being able to address the utilities claims. Symmetry means the 90-10 applies in overrun and underrun scenarios. So in an overrun, 90%, let's stay with the 9-10 just for simplicity. In an overrun scenario, 90% is covered by customers, 90% of the extra cost, and 10% by customers. If the policy is symmetrical, in an underrun scenario, meaning a savings scenario, customers keep 90%, the utility keeps 10%. In an asymmetrical policy, those percentages can change, meaning it could be 90-10 for the overrun, but let's say 95-5 for the underrun, in which case utilities get to keep 5% of the savings, but are responsible for 10% of overruns. That gets into issues where utilities could claim they are more exposed to the downside than the upside. And that's why a symmetrical policy is one that I prefer. And then caps. Caps is another good way of limiting their exposure. I'll get into this in a little bit with two practical examples. This goes back to the point that I was making. I just want to make this super clear throughout the presentation, where fuel cost sharing mechanisms actually could offer upside, not only downside for the utilities. Number one is the symmetrical sharing that I just mentioned, where they keep a portion of the savings when there are savings. And something that I like here, there is a quote from an intervener, Blue Planet, in a case in Hawaii in 28. This was in 2011, I think, where it said over time, it says fuel cost sharing could over time be as likely to be positive as negative. And importantly, critics of fuel cost sharing only focus on a scenario where it is negative. Then the other way, the orange bucket here, is another way it can be positive. And it is because fuel cost sharing frameworks broaden the scope of recoverable costs. They tend to look at net power costs. So the policy tends to cover net power costs. And those includes other things. Those include transmission rights, wholesale sales, ancillary services. Those are other costs that in the current grid, those could be significant. And the status quo policies like fuel adjustment mechanisms or clauses, they typically don't cover those. They typically just cover physical fuel. So here, the broader scope just better reflects how the grid actually works today and offers more protection against extreme market swings. Okay, despite the policy, despite that it can be positive, sorry, I have hair in my face, despite that it could be positive as negative, or the likelihood is the same, critics claim two key arguments. Number one is that transitioning from 100% pass-through policy to a fuel cost sharing increases the cost of capital, justifying higher allowed returns on equity. The number two is that utilities shouldn't bear risk they don't control. What they refer to here is that fuel prices are not under their control. That those are determined by regional and global supply demand dynamics, and so they shouldn't be responsible for those. So in the paper that we wrote for RMI, we looked into these arguments, and here I'm gonna start with argument one. How do critics get from higher exposure to fuel risk warranting higher allowed ROEs? I'm going to go through these boxes from left to right. So the number one is just higher exposure, or like having exposure to fuel cost risk. Utilities claim, or critics claim, it's going to increase earnings variability. That is true. But one thing is, remember, they assume this to always be negative, and that is incorrect. If it's always negative, which is the assumption here, then they claim that financial risk increases, and therefore, on one side, risk premiums by investors are going to increase, and on the other side, credit rating metrics are going to be impacted. All those things drive higher cost of capital, and therefore, they say they required higher allowed ROEs. Now, we're going to spend time on this, but based on financial theory and a review of regulatory precedents over the past 15 years across 11 states, we found this claim to be overstated. And the main issue here is that they conflate, like critics or utilities conflate, short-term earnings variability, seem to always be negative, with the market-wide risk that determines the cost of capital. So bear with me here. We're going to spend a little bit of time on this. Something that is not on the slide, but regulators set allowed returns mostly or ideally in line with the cost of equity. Meaning an investor is going to put money into a company, is going to buy shares of that company if the return they're getting is equal or above the return that they require. That is the allowed return versus the cost of equity. Now, the models, the economic theoretical models that are there to determine the cost of equity are the discounted cash flow, the capital asset pricing model, and the risk premium model. All those measure systematic risk. This is a market-wide risk that investors cannot diversify away. And fuel cost sharing doesn't create that kind of risk. It creates a company-specific risk, also called an idiosyncratic risk, which is a risk that investors could diversify away. And let's remember, this is important, this risk is just as likely to work in the utility's favor as against it. And interestingly, there is a quote here from one of the presidents. This was Rocky Mountain Power in Wyoming in 2011, where the utility itself, the expert representing the utility says, the results from the DCF or risk premium models have nothing to do with the utility's operating profit or fluctuations in utilities operating portfolios in the normal course of business. This is the type of risk that fuel cost sharing creates, is one that introduces variability to the operating business, could be positive, could be negative, but it has nothing to do with the models that are used to calculate cost of equity. So that's on the financial theory side. Now, the regulatory precedent. We looked at 11 states over the past 15 years that have gone through similar proceedings over the past 15 years. Of those 11 states, 9 actually have fuel cost sharing policies in place, and those were the ones shown on the slides by Oliver. Of those 9, only 2 are actually very relevant for this, and those 2 are Montana and Hawaii. Montana, that one is Northwestern Energy in 2018, and in Hawaii, it was Hawaiian Electric Company also in 2018. In both cases, this utilities transition from 100% pass-through, so 100% of the risk was borne by the utility, to fuel cost sharing. And in both cases, authorized ROEs didn't change despite claims by utilities to increase allowed returns. In other cases, in the other 7 states, it was a different transition. They transitioned from fuel costs that were fixed in rates, meaning there was no pass-through. Utilities were responsible for 100% of fuel cost variations, to fuel cost sharing. So, by the critics' own logic, bear with me here, if critics of fuel cost sharing are saying, if I bear fuel risk, some fuel risk, then my returns should be higher. In this case, it's the opposite. They went from bearing 100% of the risk to sharing the risk with customers. So using the same rationale, you would say the risk came down, so the allowed returns should come down. But of course, the utilities didn't argue for that or didn't request cuts in their allowed returns. Now, there are 2 cases that are exceptions here, Vermont in 2006 and Missouri in 2015, where they did see changes in their ROEs, and it was actually declines. There were declines in their ROEs, allowed returns. Vermont was stated, it was in 2006, and Missouri in 2015 is not relevant as a precedent because the change in the ROE was actually based on a broader assessment of market risk that happened at the same time of the implementation of fuel cost sharing, but it was not related to fuel cost sharing itself. Okay, so we have spent that time talking about the equity side of the equation. How about credit markets? Could moving from a FAM or a fuel adjustment mechanism to fuel cost sharing make it more expensive for utilities to raise debt? Credit rating agencies definitely value predictability. However, critics of fuel cost sharing tend to ignore 5 key points. Number 1, fuel cost sharing could be positive for the bottom line, which we already talked about this. Number 2, rate affordability and flexibility are also key factors in credit ratings methodologies. So recently, Fitch, actually back in June, they downgraded their North American utility and power sector outlook, specifically related to affordability issues, where they had flagged affordability as a risk in December of 2025. But by mid-2026, the affordability had deteriorated faster than they anticipated, so they downgraded the sector. Number 3, utilities remain far from any threshold at which capital access could be impaired. We're not going to get into this because of timing issues, but there are multiple reports, papers, studies by RMI and other institutions showing that they're far from impacting the utilities' capital access. The last point here is policy design. Regulators, when looking at fuel cost sharing, have many design features at their disposal to basically limit extreme scenarios and ensure the utility's financial stability is not impaired. This goes back to when we talked about the design features, and I mentioned that I was going to talk about caps later. Basically, here there are two examples of caps that I like to avoid, the key arguments that utilities make. One is the one that is used in Hawaii in their energy cost recovery clause. And that is basically a cap to the utility exposure. It can be a percentage. It can be the utility is not going to be responsible for, let's say, differences of more than 10% of the baseline. Or it could be a dollar value. It could be a percentage of revenue of the previous year. Another way of doing a cap is an earnings test, which basically links the ability to credit or charge customers to the utility's actual ROE. And this is my preferred way of doing this. And this is Pacific Corp in Oregon. And the way that works is, let's assume a utility has an authorized return ROE of 10%, but their actual ROE is 11.5%. So they're actually earning above their allowed returns. If there is an overrunning scenario in which fuel costs are higher than expected, in that case, it makes sense, or numbers would say that they can cover part of that differential without impacting their ability to raise capital, because their actual ROE is 150 basis points above their authorized return. Now, on the other side would work the same way. If, let's say, the utility is actually earning 9% ROEs, so their actual ROE is 9% versus the allowed 10%. In that case, if there's an overrun scenario, costs are higher than projected, then you could say that the utility is already earning below their allowed level, then in that case, customers are going to pay 100% of the difference. Is that fair? No. I think we already talked about customers did not have a say in the technology that was chosen. Customers did not have a say in any of the risk tools that exist to control fuel costs. But in this case, the utility, we would be certain that the fuel cost sharing mechanism itself is not impacting their financials, so that they don't get into a situation where their credit metrics are impaired, or if cost of equity models are applied incorrectly, then people would claim that their cost of equity is increasing even when it's not. Okay, and I'm just going to spend 2 more minutes on this, and then I think we'll open it up for questions. But the second argument is that fuel prices determined by global supply-demand dynamics or extreme weather events are outside the utility's control, and therefore they should not bear financial responsibility for changes in fuel costs. The counter-argument is that prices are external, but outcomes are not. Although spot prices themselves are outside the utility's control, we agree with that, fuel cost outcomes reflect a combination of external conditions and utility risk management choices. So we can see this better in this slide. On the left side, you have the things that utilities cannot control. They cannot control global natural gas and power market prices. They cannot control extreme weather events. They cannot control geopolitical supply shocks. However, utilities can control hedging strategy, contract structure and duration, procurement timing and storage decisions, and resource mix in long-term planning. It is the combination of these two buckets that ultimately determines fuel cost outcomes. So I think we're close to finishing. Yes, the 4 key takeaways. If you're just going to remember 4 things outside of this webcast, number 1, critics assume the fuel cost sharing driven earnings variability is always negative, and as we saw, that is just not correct. Number 2, there is confusion between potential short-term operational variability, which is what happens with fuel cost sharing, and the market-wide risk that determines the cost of equity. Number 3, There is also confusion between fuel outcomes and fuel prices. Utilities cannot control fuel prices, but they have a big say on fuel outcomes. And then fourth is around the role of policy design. Properly designed fuel cost sharing can be a structure to promote least cost fuel procurement, adequate resource planning, and also moderate shocks for customers. And all this without compromising the utility's financial integrity or access to capital. So that's all on my end. And I think now we're gonna open it up for questions from the Q&A box.
Awesome. Thank you again for joining us, Laura, and sharing your expertise and for helping us parse through some of these nuances. This first question is alluding to something you mentioned in your presentation about asymmetric sharing systems. Would the ROE analysis change with an asymmetric sharing system rather than the symmetric version with different debt and sharing bands for over collection and under collection?
They wouldn't. They wouldn't because it's even if it's asymmetrical, where utilities have more exposure to the downside versus the upside, there is operational earnings variability ultimately, and it's not a market-wide risk. So I think that the clear distinction here is that what determines the cost of equity, which is then a proxy for the allowed ROE, is market-wide risk. And a change from 100% pass-through to fuel cost sharing simply doesn't change market risk. It is utility specific, and it's a risk that utilities could diversify away.
This next question goes into some of the aspects when designing this type of mechanism. So this presentation shows that fuel cost sharing can improve incentives without materially increasing utility risk. What aspects of that design, whether it's sharing percentages, caps, deadbands, or earnings tests, do you think are most important for getting that balance right?
I think the two design features that I think are most important is the symmetrical, either if the symmetrical or asymmetrical component. I do see a case in which if it's asymmetrical, it gives critics more arguments to say this is not fair for them. So the symmetry of the policy for me is important. And I also think the caps, and I particularly talked about the earnings test one, that is a very good way of linking the utility's ability to pay for overrun scenarios if their financial situation that they are currently in allows that. So I think those policy design features are key. These are proceedings that just really take like life on their own. You can see in terms of sharing percentages, even in these scenarios, utility, the 90-10 that Oliver was talking about, utilities are still eating 90% of the risk. Even when they, back again to the presentation, they had no say in the selection of that technology. So it's just 10% in that scenario that utilities are responsible for. That's actually a, how we call this, one of the worst fuel cost sharing policies that are out there, not worst in terms of it being bad, but worse for the utilities because it's 10% at risk for them. And in many cases, it's 2%, 5%, 7%, so it's much smaller. So with all this to say is every single design feature that I mentioned and some others I didn't have the time to expand on become big components in the proceedings, but I think caps and the symmetry of the policy are key things to address the concerns the utilities are going to bring to the table.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. For this next question, what can advocates do to preempt these types of arguments and help educate their regulators before debates over ROE come up?
I think educate themselves with resources like this. RMI actually, and I'm not here, doing marketing for RMI just because this is RMI hosted, but they have actually done a lot of work on this. So there are a lot of resources in the website of how this works, what it has done in states that have implemented it, and what's the cost in other states, and the paper. So this paper that we wrote, it literally dives into all the states that have gone into this. Of course, the presentation was short because we don't have a lot of time. The report is 30 pages long. At the end, there's an appendix with all the claims that utilities make around this topic. So I would say educate themselves, looking at all these resources. The two that are more important, I would say, is Hawaii 2018 and Montana also 2018. And the reason is because even though we have 9 states that have done it, the transitions were very different. Only Hawaii and Montana are the ones that transition from 100% pass-through to fuel cost sharing. So this is where the higher allowed ROE claim comes in. In the other cases, it's just completely the opposite. Let's see. Yeah, I would say nowadays, there are many publicly available resources where advocates and regulators can educate themselves ahead of these proceedings.
Okay. This next question is looking for specific examples or case studies where fuel cost sharing has shifted a utility away from a new gas generation plant, but I'd like to broaden that to a change in procurement in general.
Can you repeat that again, please?
Yes. Are there any case studies or utilities that fuel cost sharing mechanism has shifted the utility away from procuring a new gas generation source?
I don't have specific examples because the focus of the report was specific on the timing when fuel cost sharing was being implemented. And I think those decisions would come in future proceedings. So I don't have the exact answer, but I can point to the Hawaii case where it goes back to the quote that I had in the presentation by Blue Planet, the intervener, where it says the policy is as likely to be positive as negative for the utility. And the more you give skin in the game to the utility in the resource decisions, the more you're likely to impact future decision making. Because if they're going to suggest bringing on a power plant that is going to be exposed to commodity risk, and now they know that they have skin in the game, that hold on, if we have extreme weather events at the pace that they're occurring these days, if with geopolitical issues that we know they're all over the place in terms of like news headlines and things changing very quickly, if we're going to be exposed to that level of commodity risk, is this still the wisest decision that we should make? So I'm sorry, I don't have, a tangible, a specific example where that happened because that was out of the scope of the project. But I think here the idea is if you are incorporating, not the idea, but basically the theory behind this is if you give utilities a skin in the game and they are responsible for the decisions that they make, that should change resource allocation.
There's a lot of excitement about that report in the Q&A, but just to follow up on that, what kind of analysis or testimony is most helpful for advocates to consider submitting to help regulators as they evaluate these arguments related to ROE and fuel cost sharing?
Yes, I gain nothing promoting my paper, but it has the summary. It has the summary of all the claims that utilities that have gone through this are saying. It has the summary of the financial theory behind why a change in a policy that is going to drive variability, positive or negative, shouldn't drive changes in allowed returns. So I would say the report, it's a good summary of all the regulatory precedents that we have out there. But to get nerd on the topic, look at the cases in Hawaii and Montana. Those are the ones that are relevant for states that are going through this transition right now.
Excellent. I would like to just say to the group, please continue submitting questions to the Q&A. We are running out of our submitted choices. One question though, what questions should regulators be asking their utilities when these arguments are raised?
Yes, I would say I would say number one is like ask the utility to walk regulators through how policy shift, a single policy shift, affects market risk. Have them explain how they make that connection, and so why ROEs should be increased, because that's just like an assumption up in the air that one should drive the other. And I haven't seen in the hundreds of filings, I haven't seen one where they actually say what's the rationale for that, knowing that if cost of equity models are properly applied, those things are completely unrelated. So I would say ask them to walk them through how they make that link, number one. Number two, why is that they assume, I think, fuel cost sharing to always be negative. In the presentation, we saw how it can be positive for the bottom line as well. And I honestly think that the assumption, or focusing the narrow assumption that is always going to be negative, is sort of a representation of utilities for risk management tools. If they're not able to control fuel costs based on all the tools that they have at their hands, or if they always assume that it's going to be negative, it's because they think their risk management choices or decisions are not the right ones in place. So yeah, why is that they always assume that those are negative? Going back in time, I mean, I don't know if this would help, and well, I don't think they would have the answers to, but back what Oliver showed in his slides, back in the 1970s, when FAM's fuel adjustment mechanisms were implemented, in most cases, back then, basically went from utilities being responsible for 100% of fuel risk to sending that risk entirely to customers. You would think then that if we follow their logic, allowed ROEs should have come down, or not should have come down. They should have requested for cuts in their allowed ROEs if we follow their logic, which I think we've presented here that is incorrect. But if we follow that same logic, they should have requested that, which of course they didn't. So I think asking them why, when that transition happened, and today the opposite would happen, and not even 1-for-1, is 90% still falls, well, not 90%, but most of the fuel cost risk falls on customers, and it's just a small percentage that falls on utilities. So why is that it's only one way, basically? Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
For the final question of the session, given that fuel cost sharing could have a positive outcome for utilities, have any utilities or industry groups come out in support of this policy?
Yes, when the states transitioned from bearing 100% of the risk. Remember, of the 9 states, I said only 2 are relevant. The other 7 states transitioned from paying or being liable for 100% of the risk to sharing that risk with customers. So of course, in that case, utilities, in some cases, I think it was in Washington, Oregon, it was actually the utility asking the regulator to implement fuel cost sharing. But that's a very different situation to what we're seeing nowadays in states that are trying to implement fuel cost sharing, because in those states, they're actually moving from fuel adjustment mechanisms where customers pay for 100%.
Well, with that, I will again say thank you for joining us, Laura. I'm going to pass to Oliver to wrap us up.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you, Laura, for that presentation and walking through the questions that we received. We will be sending out these materials afterwards, but just wanted to flag a number of resources that we have available, some of which have been highlighted already. This first link is Laura's report, and then RMI has a number of resources available too. This image on the right is a screenshot of that tool that I mentioned earlier, where you can go in and kind of test out results of this policy yourself. I also want to mention that we at RMI are available to work with you and support your work on these issues and be a resource. If you work at a public utility commission or a consumer advocate or other public interest intervener, we'd be really happy to connect and share any insights that we have and work with you to identify potential solutions or policy opportunities. Please do reach out. We would really be interested in chatting further. And with that, we'll close the webinar. Thank you everyone so much for attending, and please look out for an email with all of these resources.